The concrete floors of the processing center at Camp Shanks echoed with the shuffling of worn German boots. It was August 1944, and Obergefreiter Günter Gräwe stood in a line with 200 other prisoners of war, salt-stained uniforms still carrying the dust of North African battlefields. The 19-year-old Wehrmacht soldier had surrendered near Tunis 3 months earlier, spent weeks in British custody, then endured the crossing of the Atlantic aboard a converted Liberty ship. Nothing in his training, nothing in the propaganda he had absorbed since childhood, had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The American sergeant processing his group spoke in broken German, directing them toward what looked like a small shop. Gräwe shuffled forward, clutching the 80 cents in military script he had been given as his daily wage for picking potatoes in eastern Washington. As he approached the shop counter, his eyes widened at the sight that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Behind glass cases sat rows of ice cream containers and bottles of Coca-Cola, their labels bright red and pristine. The American soldier behind the counter, a corporal from Iowa named James Mitchell, watched as Gräwe stood frozen, staring at the display. "Well, what'll it be, Fritz?" Mitchell asked, not unkindly. He had processed thousands of German prisoners through this same routine, but he never tired of watching their faces during these first encounters with American abundance. Gräwe would later write in a letter to historian Marie McCaffrey in 2016. "It was in August or September 1944 when I stood in front of a shop in the POW camp at Fort Lewis considering what to buy first, an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years ago. The weight of that moment struck deeper than simple hunger or thirst. For 3 years, German propaganda had painted America as a nation on the brink of collapse, its people starving while resources flowed to an unsustainable war effort. Joseph Goebbels had proclaimed repeatedly that American capitalism was crumbling, that the home front was in chaos, that luxuries were impossible to obtain. Yet here stood Gräwe, a prisoner in enemy hands, faced with an abundance of consumer goods that exceeded anything he had known in peacetime Germany. The scope of this psychological shock extended far beyond individual moments of recognition. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States housed 425,000 German prisoners of war in 700 camps scattered across 46 states. An additional 51,000 Italian prisoners occupied 21 camps across 18 states, while 5,424 Japanese prisoners filled out the remainder of what became the largest prisoner of war program in American history. These numbers represented more than administrative statistics. They chronicled a massive collision between propaganda and reality, between ideology and industrial capacity, between the promises of totalitarian regimes and the material abundance of American democracy. The prisoners arriving on American shores carried with them not just the physical wounds of defeat, but the psychological framework of societies that had been told for years that their enemies were weak, decadent, and on the verge of collapse. Hans Moels, captured with the 21st Panzer Division near El Alamein, later recalled in interviews conducted by the University of Oklahoma, "We had been told Americans were a soulless and cultureless people. After we reached the United States, German prisoners had difficulty rationalizing what they believed and what they saw. The camps themselves defied every expectation shaped by Nazi ideology." At Camp Gruber in Oklahoma, 4,702 German prisoners at peak capacity found themselves housed in facilities that rivaled the best military installations in Germany. The camp covered 67,000 acres of eastern Oklahoma countryside, with 3,000 wooden buildings including 479 barracks, 100 hospital buildings, 55 administration buildings, 12 chapels, 210 mess halls, 221 recreation buildings, and 5 theaters. Feldwebel Walter Schmid, who arrived at Camp Gruber in June 1943 after the surrender of the Afrika Korps in Tunisia, initially found the site foreboding. The camp sat in a shallow, treeless valley surrounded by double rows of barbed wire and commanded by watchtowers manned by military police with machine guns. But as the weeks passed, Schmid began to notice details that contradicted everything he had been taught about American society. The food distribution alone challenged fundamental assumptions about wartime scarcity. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, Prisoners of war were entitled to the same quality and quantity of food as the detaining power's own troops at base camps. This meant that German prisoners received fresh fruit and vegetables, dairy products, butter, eggs, and meat in quantities that exceeded what they had known even in peacetime Germany. A typical daily menu at Camp Gruber included breakfast of eggs, bacon, toast, butter, jam, and coffee, lunch of roast beef, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and milk, dinner of chicken, rice, green vegetables, bread, and dessert. The daily caloric intake ranged from 2,500 calories for sedentary prisoners to 3,400 calories for those engaged in moderate activity. These numbers stood in stark contrast to conditions in Germany during the same period. By 1944, civilian rations in Berlin had dropped to 1,800 calories per day, with bread often made from sawdust, potato peels, and straw flour. The ersatz coffee served in German cities was brewed from acorns, chicory, and roasted grain. Sugar had become so scarce that ersatz sweeteners were manufactured from coal tar derivatives. Lieutenant Franz May, a member of the Afrika Korps captured in 1943, returned to Camp Gruber at age 90 in 2012 for a nostalgic visit. By then a retired engineer living in Stuttgart, May reflected on his captivity with remarkable candor. For a prisoner, it was a very good time. If I had been taken on the Russian front, my chance of survival would have been questionable. May's perspective highlighted one of the most significant psychological factors affecting German prisoner morale. The contrast between American treatment and Soviet treatment of German prisoners was becoming clear even during wartime. While exact figures remained classified, German soldiers increasingly understood that capture by Soviet forces meant probable death. Of the approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by Soviet forces, historians estimate that over 1 million died in captivity. The abundance extended far beyond basic necessities. Each prisoner earned between 10 and 80 cents per day for work performed, with the amount depending on military rank and political reliability. Nazi Party members and SS personnel received the minimum 10 cents daily, while regular Wehrmacht soldiers earned up to 80 cents. This payment came in the form of camp script that could be spent at post-exchange style stores within each compound. These camp stores, or canteens, offered an array of consumer goods that amazed German prisoners accustomed to wartime shortages. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, the canteen sold candy, toiletries, tobacco products, beer, soft drinks, and ice cream. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietrich, captured during the Normandy campaign and transferred to Concordia in late 1944, later described his first visit to the camp canteen. I stood before shelves filled with American chocolate bars, chewing gum, cigarettes of brands I had never heard of, and bottles of Coca-Cola lined up like soldiers on parade. In Germany, we had not seen such variety even before the war. The psychological impact of Coca-Cola specifically cannot be overstated. By 1944, Coca-Cola had become one of the most recognizable symbols of American consumer culture worldwide. The company was producing 1.9 billion servings per day globally, with over 10,000 soft drinks manufactured by Coca-Cola consumed every second. For German prisoners who had been fed years of propaganda about American weakness and cultural poverty, the ubiquity and quality of Coca-Cola represented a direct challenge to everything they had been taught. Technical Sergeant Hermann Schneckmann, a Luftwaffe mechanic supporting Rommel's Afrika Korps when captured, returned to Camp Gruber in August 1987 to express his gratitude for the treatment he received as a prisoner of war. During his visit, Schneckmann recalled his amazement at American industrial capacity as demonstrated through consumer goods availability. We could not understand how a nation at war could maintain such production of luxury items. In Germany, all resources went to the war effort. Here, the war seemed almost secondary to normal life. This observation touched on a fundamental difference between American and German approaches to wartime production. While Germany had implemented total war policies that eliminated most consumer goods production, American industry had expanded to meet both military and civilian demands simultaneously. The United States produced not only the weapons and equipment necessary for global warfare, but maintained production lines for automobiles, household appliances, and consumer goods that kept civilian morale high and demonstrated industrial superiority to captured enemies. The ice cream industry provided a perfect example of this dual-purpose production. Despite wartime rationing of sugar and dairy products, American ice cream production continued throughout the war years. By 1944, 87% of American households maintained ice cream in their freezers at any given time. Per capita consumption remained robust, with 74% of Americans consuming ice cream at least once weekly. For German prisoners accustomed to ersatz desserts made from saccharin and artificial flavoring, American ice cream represented luxury beyond imagination. At Camp Hereford in Texas, Italian prisoner Capitano Enrico Benedetti wrote to his family in Milano, "Yesterday the Americans served ice cream after dinner. Real ice cream with cream and sugar, flavored with vanilla. I had not tasted such a thing since before the war began. The guards eat it as though it were ordinary food." The Italian prisoner experience added another layer to the story of abundance shock. Italy's surrender in September 1943 created a complex situation for Italian prisoners of war in American custody. When the Badoglio government declared war on Germany in October 1943, Italian prisoners were offered the opportunity to join Italian service units and receive increased privileges and freedom of movement. Of the 51,000 Italian prisoners in American custody, over 45,000 volunteered for service units. They received American Army uniforms with Italian insignia, monthly wages of $24, with 1/3 paid in cash and 2/3 in camp script, and permission to leave campgrounds for work assignments and limited recreation. Soldato William Red Verzola, captured with an Italian unit in North Africa, found himself assigned to Camp Miles Standish in Taunton, Massachusetts. By 1944, Verzola had joined an Italian service unit and was working as a camp cook. On Friday evenings, he regularly visited Charlie Pino's Victory Club in nearby Norton, where he socialized with American soldiers and local civilians over beer and conversation. Verzola's experience illustrated how Italian prisoners, reclassified as co-belligerents rather than enemies, gained unprecedented access to American civilian life. He later recalled, "I could walk into any store in Norton and buy cigarettes, candy, or a bottle of Coca-Cola just like an American soldier. The abundance in these small American towns exceeded what I had known in Rome before the war." The transformation of Italian prisoners from enemies to allies provided American authorities with valuable intelligence about Axis military capabilities and civilian conditions. During interrogation sessions, Italian prisoners consistently reported food shortages, industrial bottlenecks, and civilian morale problems that contradicted fascist propaganda claims about Italian strength and preparedness. Maggiore Giuseppe Albertini, an artillery officer captured during the Sicily campaign, provided detailed reports about Italian industrial capacity during his debriefing at Camp Florence in Arizona. Albertini's information, cross-referenced with similar reports from hundreds of other Italian prisoners, painted a picture of an Axis economy already strained to breaking point by mid-1943. Meanwhile, German prisoners provided equally valuable intelligence, though they proved more resistant to cooperation due to continued Nazi indoctrination and fear of post-war retribution. However, their daily interactions with American abundance gradually eroded ideological certainty. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, German prisoners were allowed to operate their own newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, which American authorities monitored for insights into prisoner morale and political attitudes. The newspaper's evolution over time revealed a gradual shift from defiant Nazi rhetoric toward pragmatic acceptance of American values. Early editions in 1943 featured articles praising German military prowess and predicting ultimate victory. By late 1944, the tone had shifted toward discussions of post-war reconstruction and the need for international cooperation. This psychological evolution accelerated after D-Day, when newly captured German prisoners arrived at American camps with first-hand knowledge of Germany's deteriorating military position. Unlike earlier prisoners who maintained faith in ultimate German victory, these later arrivals understood the war's likely outcome and were more willing to engage with American re-education programs. The re-education efforts, formerly known as the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, aimed to introduce German prisoners to democratic principles and American values. The program included English language instruction, American history courses, and exposure to American literature, music, and films. However, the most effective re-education tool proved to be simple exposure to American abundance and civilian life. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, German prisoners working on local farms regularly interacted with American farming families who invited them to share meals and participate in community activities. Gefreiter Anton Kessler, captured during the Battle of the Bulge and assigned to work on the Johnson farm near Hattiesburg, later wrote, "The Johnson family treated me not as an enemy, but as a human being who happened to be on the wrong side of a war. Mrs. Johnson served meals with fresh vegetables, milk, butter, and meat in quantities I had not seen since childhood. When I asked about rationing, Mr. Johnson laughed and said they had more food than they could eat." These civilian interactions multiplied the impact of camp abundance by demonstrating that American prosperity extended far beyond military installations. German prisoners working in American communities witnessed suburban homes with multiple automobiles, well-stocked grocery stores, and consumer goods displays that exceeded anything available in European cities, even during peacetime. The agricultural work program itself served as a powerful demonstration of American industrial capacity. German prisoners participated in harvest operations that utilized mechanized equipment, chemical fertilizers, and agricultural techniques that were decades ahead of European farming practices. At Camp Greeley in Colorado, German prisoners working sugar beet fields operated John Deere tractors, mechanized harvesters, and irrigation systems that produced crop yields per acre that exceeded German averages by 300%. Unteroffizier Heinrich Müller, an engineering specialist captured near Caen during the Normandy campaign, worked on road construction projects around Camp Polk in Louisiana. Müller's technical background allowed him to appreciate the sophistication of American construction equipment and techniques. In letters to his brother in Munich, intercepted and translated by American intelligence, Müller wrote, "The Americans have machines I have never seen before. Their concrete mixing equipment, earth-moving machinery, and construction techniques are far advanced beyond anything we used in Germany. I begin to understand how they built their war production so quickly." The scale of American production became even more apparent to prisoners assigned to factory work. At the Hanford facility in Washington, German prisoners from the federal prison system worked alongside Italian prisoners of war to maintain agricultural operations and support the Manhattan Project's infrastructure needs. While the prisoners had no knowledge of the facility's nuclear weapons research, they could observe the massive scale of construction, the unlimited resources devoted to the project, and the seamless integration of civilian contractors, military personnel, and foreign workers. Camp Columbia, the federal prison facility at Hanford, housed prisoners in Quonset huts identical to those used for American military personnel. The prisoners received the same food, medical care, and recreational facilities as American soldiers stationed at the site. 255 Italian prisoners from the 255th Quartermaster Salvage and Repair Company worked at the Pasco rail yards, loading and unloading up to 225 freight cars daily. Capitano Enrico Tagliavacca, the Italian officer commanding the unit under American supervision, marveled at the volume of goods flowing through the rail yards. Military supplies, construction materials, food shipments, and consumer goods moved in continuous streams that dwarfed anything he had witnessed in Italy. The prisoners particularly enjoyed operating forklifts and other mechanized equipment that was rare in Italian industry. The technical sophistication of American equipment impressed prisoners throughout the camp system. At Camp Gruber, German prisoners worked on construction projects that utilized power tools, precision measurement instruments, and standardized components that enabled rapid, high-quality construction. The camp's drainage system, designed and built partially by German prisoners, featured brick-lined canals that remained in excellent condition decades later, testament to both German craftsmanship and American materials. The standardization and mass production techniques observed by prisoners challenged fundamental assumptions about American industrial organization. Nazi propaganda had portrayed American industry as chaotic, individualistic, and incapable of the coordination necessary for effective war production. Instead, prisoners witnessed industrial processes that demonstrated superior organization, quality control, and efficiency. The Coca-Cola production and distribution system provided a perfect example of American industrial coordination. Prisoners could observe Coca-Cola delivery trucks servicing camp canteens on regular schedules, maintaining consistent product quality and availability regardless of location. The syrup concentrate was manufactured in centralized facilities, then distributed to regional bottling plants that served local markets with precision timing. For prisoners accustomed to German industrial systems that relied on craft production methods and regional variations, American standardization represented a revelation. Obergefreiter Kurt Zimmermann, assigned to work in the camp motor pool at Fort Lewis, studied American vehicle maintenance procedures and found them far superior to German methods. In interviews conducted years later, Zimmermann recalled, American trucks, jeeps, and cars were designed for easy maintenance. Parts were standardized across different models. Repair manuals were clear and detailed. German equipment was precise but complex. American equipment was simple but effective. The post-war implications of these observations became clear as former prisoners returned to Germany and participated in Reconstruction efforts. Many former prisoners became advocates for American-style mass production techniques, standardization, and quality control methods. They promoted the Marshall Plan and supported American efforts to rebuild German industry along American organizational principles. Hermann Schneckmann, the Luftwaffe mechanic who returned to Camp Gruber in 1987, had spent his post-war career implementing American production methods in German aircraft manufacturing. During his visit, he credited his prisoner of war experience with teaching him principles of industrial organization that shaped his entire professional life. The long-term psychological impact extended beyond industrial techniques to fundamental attitudes about democracy, individual rights, and international cooperation. German prisoners who experienced American abundance while maintaining their human dignity developed lasting appreciation for American values that influenced German political development during the Cold War era. Franz May, the Afrika Korps veteran who revisited Camp Gruber in 2012, had become a successful engineer and strong supporter of NATO and European-American cooperation. During his visit, he reflected on how his prisoner experience had shaped his post-war worldview. I learned that enemies could be treated with respect and humanity. I learned that prosperity and military strength could coexist. I learned that democracy was not weakness but strength. The contrast with other prisoner of war experiences heightened the impact of American abundance. German prisoners were acutely aware that American prisoners in German hands received far less generous treatment, particularly as Germany's resources dwindled during the final war years. By late 1944, American prisoners in German camps were receiving potato-based rations that provided barely adequate nutrition, supplemented irregularly by Red Cross parcels when transportation allowed. The comparison with Japanese treatment of prisoners was even more stark. American prisoners in Japanese custody faced deliberate starvation, medical neglect, and systematic brutality that resulted in a 28% mortality rate. German prisoners in American custody faced a mortality rate of less than 1%, with most deaths resulting from pre-existing medical conditions or accidents rather than deliberate mistreatment. These statistics were not lost on German prisoners, who understood that their treatment in American hands far exceeded international legal requirements and contrasted sharply with Axis treatment of enemy prisoners. The psychological impact of this disparity contributed to a fundamental reassessment of moral authority that influenced German attitudes toward American leadership in the post-war era. The civilian response to prisoner of war camps provided another dimension of abundance shock. Despite initial concerns about housing enemy soldiers on American soil, most American communities near prisoner camps developed positive relationships with their temporary residents. Local newspapers regularly reported on prisoner contributions to agricultural and industrial production, while civilian employers praised prisoner work ethic and technical skills. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, local farmer Donald Kerr regularly employed German prisoners during harvest seasons. Kerr, who delivered milk to the camp, developed friendships with several prisoners and corresponded with them after the war. In interviews conducted decades later, Kerr recalled, "They were just young men caught up in a war they didn't start. They worked hard, caused no trouble, and were grateful for decent treatment. I sent packages to several of them after they returned to Germany." The post-war correspondence between American civilians and former prisoners provided valuable insights into the long-term impact of abundance exposure. Mary Dill of Wagoner, Oklahoma, worked at Camp Gruber during the war and maintained correspondence with former prisoners for decades afterward. She regularly sent care packages containing American consumer goods, clothing, and food to former prisoners struggling with post-war shortages in Germany. The letters she received in return documented the harsh conditions in post-war Germany and the prisoners' continuing appreciation for American abundance. One former prisoner wrote in 1947, "We remember the ice cream and Coca-Cola you served us at Camp Gruber. Here in Germany we have ersatz coffee made from acorns and bread made from potato flour." American abundance was not propaganda but reality. The contrast between American abundance and post-war European scarcity reinforced the psychological impact of the prisoner experience. German prisoners returned to a homeland devastated by strategic bombing, occupied by foreign armies, and struggling with severe food shortages. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, offered hope for recovery, but many Germans initially viewed American aid offers with suspicion. Former prisoners of war became influential advocates for accepting American assistance and adopting American economic principles. They had witnessed American productive capacity firsthand and understood that American aid offers represented genuine opportunities rather than attempts at economic domination. Their advocacy proved crucial in overcoming initial German resistance to Marshall Plan participation. The industrial knowledge gained by prisoners during their American captivity provided immediate practical benefits for German Reconstruction. Former prisoners brought back detailed understanding of American manufacturing techniques, quality control procedures, and organizational methods that accelerated German industrial recovery. At the Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg, former prisoner Heinrich Nordhoff implemented production methods he had observed while working in American automotive plants during his captivity. The assembly line techniques, standardized components, and quality control procedures he introduced helped transform Volkswagen from a struggling German company into a globally competitive automobile manufacturer. The consumer goods industries particularly benefited from prisoner knowledge of American methods. Former prisoners who had worked in American food processing plants, textile factories, and consumer goods manufacturing facilities brought back detailed understanding of equipment, procedures, and organizational methods that enabled rapid expansion of German consumer production. The Coca-Cola Company's expansion into post-war Germany provided a symbolic completion of the abundance shock cycle. In 1949, Coca-Cola resumed operations in Germany with strong support from former prisoners who had developed appreciation for the product during their American captivity. The familiar red and white logo became a symbol of recovery, prosperity, and renewed connection to the broader Western world. By 1950, Coca-Cola plants in Hamburg, Munich, and Stuttgart were producing millions of bottles monthly for German consumers eager to experience the abundance they had heard about from returned prisoners. The success of Coca-Cola in Germany demonstrated how effectively prisoner experiences had transmitted positive impressions of American consumer culture. The broader implications extended far beyond individual products or companies. The prisoner experience had provided over 400,000 German and Italian soldiers with first-hand exposure to American society at its most prosperous moment. These men returned to Europe as informal ambassadors for American values, American methods, and American leadership in the post-war world. Their influence proved particularly important during the early Cold War period, when European nations faced choices between American and Soviet models of social organization. Former prisoners overwhelmingly supported alignment with the United States, having witnessed both American abundance and American humanity during their captivity. The technical knowledge transfer accelerated European recovery and strengthened transatlantic economic ties. Former prisoners became business partners with American companies, facilitators of technology transfer agreements, and advocates for European integration with American-led international institutions. The psychological transformation proved equally important for long-term international relations. Men who had been taught to view Americans as cultural inferiors and military weaklings developed lasting respect for American capabilities and values. This transformation contributed to the stable alliance relationships that characterized the post-war Western world. The abundance shock experienced by Axis prisoners in American camps represented more than individual psychological adjustment to unexpected circumstances. It demonstrated the power of material prosperity to challenge ideological assumptions, transform political attitudes, and build foundations for international cooperation. The ice cream and Coca-Cola that amazed prisoners in 1944 became symbols of a broader American approach to international relations based on strength demonstrated through prosperity rather than domination imposed through force. This approach proved remarkably effective in transforming former enemies into allies and establishing the foundations for decades of peaceful cooperation. As Günter Gräwe stood in that prisoner of war canteen in August 1944, contemplating whether to purchase ice cream or Coca-Cola with his 80 cents in camp script, he could not have imagined the broader historical significance of his choice. His decision represented not just individual preference, but participation in a transformation process that would reshape European attitudes toward America and establish foundations for the post-war international order. The abundance he witnessed, the humanity he experienced, and the prosperity he observed challenged every assumption that Nazi propaganda had planted in his young mind. The ice cream was real, the Coca-Cola was available, and the American dream was more than political rhetoric. For 425,000 German prisoners and 51,000 Italian prisoners, abundance shock became the foundation for a fundamental reassessment of American society and values. The lesson extended far beyond wartime prisoner management to broader questions of international influence and cultural transformation. American abundance, freely shared with captured enemies, proved more persuasive than any propaganda campaign in demonstrating the superiority of democratic capitalism over totalitarian alternatives. The prisoners who returned to Europe carrying memories of American ice cream and Coca-Cola became agents of change who accelerated European recovery, strengthened transatlantic relationships, and established foundations for lasting peace between former enemies. Their transformation from adversaries to advocates represented one of the most successful applications of soft power in modern international relations. In the decades that followed, as the Cold War tested Western resolve and Soviet propaganda challenged American leadership, the testimonies of former prisoners provided powerful counter-narratives based on personal experience rather than political theory. Their voices carried special authority because they had witnessed American society during wartime stress, when abundance might have been expected to disappear, yet had found prosperity and humanity intact. The abundance shock of 1944 became a foundation stone for the Western alliance that emerged from World War II's ashes. Ice cream and Coca-Cola, symbols of American consumer culture, had proven more effective than military occupation in winning hearts and minds of former enemies. The lesson would influence American foreign policy for generations to come, as policymakers learned to appreciate the power of demonstrated prosperity in advancing national interests and international stability. The camps themselves became inadvertent laboratories for cultural exchange and mutual understanding. American guards and German prisoners developed relationships that transcended national boundaries and ideological differences. These personal connections, multiplied across hundreds of camps and thousands of individual relationships, created networks of mutual respect that facilitated post-war reconciliation and cooperation. As the last German prisoners departed American soil in May 1946, they carried with them more than personal memories of ice cream and Coca-Cola. They carried the seeds of a transformed relationship between Germany and America that would flourish in the decades ahead. Their children and grandchildren would grow up as allies rather than enemies, partners in a democratic alliance that traced its origins to abundance shared behind barbed wire in the American countryside. The story of German and Italian prisoners discovering American abundance in the midst of global warfare demonstrated how generosity could transform enemies into friends, how prosperity could challenge ideology, and how simple acts of humanity could establish foundations for lasting peace. In an era when international relations often seemed governed by force and fear, the prisoner of war experience offered hope that understanding and cooperation remained possible between peoples who shared fundamental human values despite political differences. The shock of abundance experienced by Axis prisoners in American camps became a testament to the power of democratic capitalism to inspire admiration even among its defeated enemies. The ice cream and Coca-Cola that amazed prisoners in 1944 became symbols of a society that could wage total war while maintaining its humanity, fight for victory while planning for peace, and demonstrate strength while extending generosity to those who had sought its destruction. Years later, as elderly men returned to visit the camps where they had spent their youth, the memories remained vivid and the gratitude genuine. Franz May at 90, Hermann Schneckmann at 70, Günter Gräwe at 91 all testified to the transformative power of abundance shared with humanity. Their stories became bridges between past and present, between former enemies and enduring allies, between the hatred of war and the hope of peace. The abundance shock that began with ice cream and Coca-Cola in American prisoner of war camps became a foundation for international understanding that outlasted the Cold War, survived the challenges of globalization, and continues to influence relationships between nations decades after the last prisoner returned home. In the end, the simple generosity of sharing prosperity with captured enemies proved to be one of America's most successful investments in international peace and stability.